The silence of a house does not change overnight. It thickens gradually, like dust settling over furniture in a room that nobody uses anymore. I am 81 years old, and for the vast majority of my life, my days were defined by the loud, relentless noise of caring for other people. I live in a modest red-brick terraced house in Leeds, where the floorboards have memorized the exact weight of my footsteps, and the walls have absorbed decades of laughter, arguments, and quiet tears. Today, my knees ache with a persistent dull throb whenever the weather turns damp, and my hands carry a slight involuntary tremor when I lift the heavy ceramic teapot to pour my morning cup. The evenings here feel significantly longer since my husband passed away, leaving me with a profound quiet that often rings in my ears. For years, I firmly believed that this loneliness was simply the final, unavoidable tax of a life spent entirely in the service of my family. My daughter Helen was the absolute centre of my universe, the single reason I pushed through the exhausting exhaustion of my younger years. For 3 decades, I worked brutally long shifts in the steaming, bleach-scented depths of a hospital laundry, my hands constantly raw from scalding water and heavy linen. I took on extra hours, ironed uniforms, and saved every spare penny in an old tin tin beneath my bed, all to ensure that Helen never felt the sharp sting of our working-class reality. When she grew up, moved away and married, I quietly continued to help her with bills whenever things were tight, never asking for a receipt, never mentioning it to her husband, just slipping the money into her account. I cared for my husband through his agonizing final illness, without ever asking Helen to pause her life, and I spent my holidays looking after my grandchildren so she could advance in her career. I thought I was building an unbreakable foundation of love. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Helen has built a magnificent, polished life for herself down in London, a life that looks as though it has been carefully clipped from the glossy pages of a high-end lifestyle magazine. She has a sprawling, immaculate home filled with expensive minimalist furniture, a circle of well-spoken, affluent friends, and a carefully curated image of absolute success. I have always been deeply proud of what she has achieved, proud of the confident, commanding woman she became. Yet, as her world expanded and grew more glittering, the space reserved for me within it began to shrink, compressing until I could barely breathe without feeling like an intruder. I was the woman who had made her flight possible, but in the gleaming altitude of her new life, I was slowly becoming an uncomfortable reminder of the gravity she had worked so hard to escape. At first, I noticed only very small, seemingly insignificant changes in the way she interacted with me. Tiny shifts that I eagerly dismissed as my own oversensitivity. When I visited her in London, we would sit in her gleaming kitchen, and if I used a phrase from the old neighbourhood or spoke with the flat, broad vowels of my youth, she would correct my pronunciation. She would do it with a quick, nervous laugh, glancing around as if the walls might overhear my lack of refinement, and she would repeat the word back to me in her clipped, acquired accent. She began asking me, with a tight, strained smile, not to go on so much about the old days, about the hospital laundry, or about the struggles we faced when she was a child. She insisted that those stories were depressing, that her friends wouldn't understand them, and that we should focus on more positive, forward-looking topics. I swallowed my pride and nodded, eager to please her. Then came the subtle, systematic dismantling of my physical identity, executed under the guise of daughterly generosity. Helen began buying me clothes that felt entirely alien to my skin, shapeless, neutral-toned, expensive garments that lacked any personality or warmth. She would hand me these beige cardigans and stiff, slate-grey trousers, explaining that it was time to update my wardrobe, that I needed to look more sophisticated when we went out. I stood before the full-length mirror in her guest room, dressed in these unfamiliar fabrics, and saw a woman I did not recognize. A woman who had been sanitized and neutralized to blend harmlessly into the background of her daughter's elegant life. I wore the clothes without complaint, convincing myself that it was just a gesture of love, completely ignoring the heavy, sinking feeling in my chest that told me I was being erased. But the distance continued to creep in, manifesting most painfully during the large family gatherings and Sunday roasts at her home. In the past, the dinner table had been a place of warmth, where I sat near the centre, passing the potatoes and listening to the chaos of my family. Now, I found myself systematically seated at the very end of the long oak table, positioned nearest to the drafty kitchen door, physically marginalized from the core of the conversation. When I tried to ask my grandchildren about their schoolwork or their friends, they would offer flat, single-word answers, their eyes never breaking contact with the glowing screens of their mobile phones. Helen's husband, a successful architect, remained perfectly polite to me, but his courtesy was profoundly distant, the kind of mechanical politeness one reserves for a hotel receptionist. He treated my presence like a domestic responsibility that had already been scheduled, managed, and mentally checked off his daily list. Whenever Helen had guests arriving at the house, I noticed how skillfully and gently she would physically maneuver me away from the main areas of engagement. If I was standing in the hallway when the doorbell rang, she would quickly place a hand on my back, ushering me toward the kitchen or the less visible sitting room, suggesting I go check on the kettle or sit somewhere more comfortable. She would speak to me kindly but briefly, her voice carrying that specific, soothing pitch usually directed at very young children or the confused elderly. I sat in the corner of her beautiful rooms, watching her laugh brilliantly with her well-dressed friends, holding her wine glass with effortless grace. I repeatedly told myself that I was being deeply silly, that people their age were just incredibly busy, that modern life was fast, and that age naturally makes a person too easily hurt by innocent oversights. That fragile illusion became significantly harder to maintain the evening Helen decided to host a very important dinner party for her senior colleagues. I had travelled down to London that morning, carrying a tin of homemade shortbread, expecting to help her peel vegetables or set the dining table. But late in the afternoon, as the caterers arrived and the house filled with the smell of roasting meats and expensive perfumes, Helen pulled me aside into the hallway. With a perfectly practiced look of deep concern, she suggested that the evening was going to be terribly loud and incredibly boring, filled with dry corporate talk. She placed a hand on my arm and told me that I might be much more comfortable staying upstairs in the guest bedroom with a nice cup of tea and a good television program. The words were wrapped in cotton, but the meaning was made of cold steel. She did not want her colleagues to see me. I agreed immediately, forcing a smile to hide the sudden sharp sting of humiliation that flooded my throat. I carried my cup of tea up the carpeted stairs, went into the guest room, and softly closed the door, sitting on the edge of the perfectly made bed. For hours, I listened to the muffled sounds of clinking crystal, roaring laughter, and lively conversation drifting up through the floorboards. I looked down at my hands, at the crooked fingers that had scrubbed and ironed and saved for decades so that she could afford to buy the very house I was now hiding in. I felt like a dark, embarrassing secret, an unsightly stain that had to be covered up before company arrived. It was in that lonely room, listening to the life I was excluded from, that the first true crack in my denial finally appeared. A few days later, while trying to be useful, I was searching for a clean dusting cloth in the large oak sideboard in her sitting room. As I reached into the very back of the bottom cupboard, my fingers brushed against the hard edge of a silver picture frame tucked away beneath a stack of old table runners. I pulled it out into the light and felt my breath catch in my throat. It was an old, beloved photograph of me holding Helen as an infant, standing on the small patch of grass behind our house in Leeds. I was wearing my faded laundry apron, my hair pinned up haphazardly, looking tired but fiercely happy. For years, that photograph had held a place of pride on her mantelpiece. Finding it buried in the dark, hidden away where no one could accidentally stumble upon it, felt like a physical blow. She had not simply rearranged her decor, she had actively curated her history, removing the rough, unpolished evidence of where she came from. The final, devastating wound, the one that irreparably changed the landscape of our relationship, occurred the following month at a charity luncheon in the city. Helen had felt obligated to invite me because her husband was out of the country and she needed to fill a seat at her sponsored table. I spent hours preparing, carefully pressing the beige dress she had bought for me, trying desperately to look the part of the sophisticated mother. Before leaving, I reached into my velvet jewellery box and clasped a small, slightly tarnished silver locket around my neck. It was the only piece of jewellery my late husband had ever been able to afford for me, given on our 10th anniversary, and it held the only piece of him I still carried into the world. It rested against my collarbone, a quiet, reassuring weight that always made me feel less alone in unfamiliar places. When we arrived at the grand, high-ceilinged hotel foyer, surrounded by women dripping in diamonds and designer silk, Helen turned to face me. Her eyes immediately dropped to my chest, and a familiar shadow of panic and irritation flashed across her perfectly made-up face. She stepped uncomfortably close to me, her voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper. She asked me, quietly but firmly, to please go to the cloakroom and remove the silver locket. When I asked her why, my voice trembling slightly, she offered a tight smile and said that the piece was lovely, of course, but it looked just a bit out of place with the elegant aesthetic of the event. She said it drew the wrong kind of attention, that it looked cheap. My fingers went completely numb. I stood in the middle of that opulent lobby, surrounded by strangers, and slowly unclasped the only thing that made me feel safe, dropping it like a heavy stone into the depths of my handbag. Halfway through the excruciatingly polite luncheon, I excused myself from the table to visit the restroom. The corridors of the hotel were lined with thick, sound-absorbing carpets and heavy mirrors that reflected my small, diminished figure. On my way back to the ballroom, I paused near a small alcove where a group of women from our table had gathered with their wine glasses. I heard Helen's voice before I saw her, projecting that effortless, musical tone she used for networking. One of her friends had politely asked about me, mentioning that I seemed very quiet. I froze behind a large marble pillar, my heart hammering violently against my ribs, unable to step forward or retreat. Helen laughed her light, nervous laugh, and the words she spoke next etched themselves into the very marrow of my bones. She told her friend that her mother was a lovely, simple woman, a product of a very different time and place. But then she lowered her voice conspiratorially, sighing as if carrying a heavy, tragic burden. She said that while she loved me, I was incredibly set in my working-class ways, and that, honestly, I was not really suited to certain company. She confessed that it was a constant strain to bring me to these events because she never knew what embarrassing parochial thing I might say or how out of place I would look. The friend murmured sympathetically, offering a toast to Helen's patience. I stood in the shadows of the alcove, pressing my hand against my chest where the silver locket should have been, feeling the cold, smooth fabric of the dress that wasn't mine. Tell me honestly, have you ever felt something like this inside your own home? I did not step out from behind the pillar. I did not confront her, scream, or cause a scene that would confirm her cruel assessment of my lack of refinement. Instead, I waited until they returned to the ballroom, and then I walked slowly back to my seat at the far edge of the table. For the remainder of the afternoon, I sat in absolute silence, my hands neatly folded in my lap, looking at the half-eaten food on my expensive porcelain plate. I did not eat, I did not speak, and I did not cry. Something profound and permanent was happening within me. The desperate, scrambling anxiety to please her, the constant fear of embarrassing her, the terrible ache of wanting to belong in her world. It all began to drain away, replaced by a deep, hollow stillness. I realized that my silence was no longer born of fear. It was born of absolute clarity. That night, lying awake in the darkness of her guest bedroom, staring at the perfectly plastered ceiling, I finally understood the tragic mathematics of our relationship. For decades, I had fundamentally mistaken being needed for being valued. I had believed that my endless utility, my money, my babysitting, my silent endurance, was the currency that purchased my daughter's respect. But in the harsh light of that charity luncheon, I saw the truth. I had become, in my daughter's eyes, nothing more than a walking, breathing reminder of a poorer, plainer life that she desperately wanted to keep hidden. My very existence was a threat to the polished narrative she had constructed for her friends and colleagues. I was a burden to be managed, a problem to be hidden away upstairs with a cup of tea. The next morning, I packed my small suitcase, kissed Helen on the cheek, and took the train back to Leeds. I did not offer any grand declarations or dramatic farewells, but the moment I turned the key in the lock of my own front door, breathing in the familiar scent of old wood and lavender, I began the quiet, meticulous work of reclaiming myself. The first thing I did was call the bank. For years, I had maintained a standing order that transferred a portion of my modest pension into a savings account for Helen's children, a sacrifice that meant I often skipped heating the house in winter. Without a tremor of hesitation, I cancelled the transfer. I stopped sending the money that she accepted without gratitude. If I was not fit to sit at her table, my money was no longer fit to cushion her bank account. The withdrawal continued in the subtle rhythms of our weekly telephone calls. When Helen rang on Sunday evenings, carrying her usual tone of distracted obligation, I stopped volunteering information. When she asked about my week, I no longer offered the self-deprecating, cheerful updates I used to invent to keep her entertained. I answered briefly, politely, and without apology. When she tried to instruct me on how to handle my garden or what vitamins I should be taking, attempting to manage me from 200 miles away, I calmly changed the subject. I stopped letting her answer questions meant for me when she accompanied me to the doctor during her rare visits. I began looking the physician directly in the eye, speaking for my own body, politely but firmly talking over Helen when she tried to interject. A few weeks later, on a crisp Tuesday morning, I put on my favourite woolen coat, the one Helen hated because it was supposedly out of fashion, clasped my silver locket around my neck, and walked down to the local high street. I made an appointment with an older, sensible solicitor who had an office above the bakery. I sat across his battered wooden desk, breathing in the smell of old paper and ink, and instructed him to completely review my will and my power of attorney. For years, Helen had been gently but persistently pushing me to sign the deed of my terraced house over to her, framing it as a practical reason to avoid future inheritance tax and to simplify matters when my health inevitably failed. I had always intended to do it, trusting her implicitly. But sitting in that office, I explicitly legally secured the property entirely in my own name, ensuring that my future was under my own control. I did not stop there. I knew that the steep stairs of my house were becoming dangerous for my knees, and Helen had recently suggested that when the time came, I should sell the house and move into the small, dark, spare room at the back of her London property, where she could keep an eye on me. The thought of living out my final days trapped in a room in a house where I was an embarrassment filled me with a cold dread. Instead, I asked the solicitor for guidance, and within a month I had quietly arranged the sale of my house and purchased a bright ground-floor retirement flat in a welcoming community on the outskirts of Leeds, entirely surrounded by people my own age, near my own friends. I made these massive life decisions without consulting Helen, without asking for her permission, and without seeking her approval. When the legal paperwork inevitably crossed her desk, as she was listed as my emergency contact, and Helen finally realised what I had done, the carefully constructed facade of her composure cracked completely. She caught the first train up to Leeds and burst through my front door, her face flushed with an ugly mixture of panic, disbelief, and genuine outrage. She found me sitting in my worn armchair, calmly drinking tea from my favourite chipped mug. She paced the living room floor, her voice rising to a frantic pitch as she accused me of losing my mind, of being incredibly stubborn, and of acting aggressively ungrateful after everything she had allegedly done to include me in her life. She demanded to know why I had refused to sign the house over, accusing me of being maliciously influenced by strangers at the solicitor's office who wanted to steal my money. I did not raise my voice, I did not cry, and I did not shrink back into the cushions of the chair as I would have done a year ago. I placed my teacup on the saucer, my hands trembling ever so slightly, but my voice remained as steady and unyielding as the stone steps outside my front door. I looked up at the daughter I had sacrificed my youth for, and I told her quietly that a mother should never, under any circumstances, have to shrink herself into the shadows just to spare her child the burden of embarrassment. I told her that I knew exactly how she spoke of me when she thought I wasn't listening, and that I refused to spend the twilight of my life apologising for my working-class hands, my old memories, or the silver locket her father gave me. For the very first time in her adult life, Helen completely lost control of the comfortable, self-serving story she had been telling herself for years. The narrative where she was the generous, patient daughter managing an old-fashioned mother. The story where she knew best and believed I simply didn't notice her subtle cruelties, evaporated in the air between us. She stood in the middle of my living room, her mouth open, unable to formulate a defence, because the absolute truth leaves no room for corporate spin. The consequences of my quiet rebellion were completely real, and they shifted the gravity of our relationship permanently. By setting my boundary, Helen instantly lost access to my constant, uncomplaining help, my unquestioned financial forgiveness, and the absolute security of assuming that her mother would always be waiting gratefully at the dark edge of her bright life. The day I finally left the terraced house, I did not feel a profound sense of loss. I felt a lightness I had not experienced in decades. I walked out of the front door carrying only a single suitcase, wearing my late husband's silver locket proudly resting against my collarbone, and holding the framed photograph of myself in the laundry apron that I had rescued from her London cupboard. I left the heavy, burdensome expectations behind me, stepping into the waiting taxi with a clear mind and an open heart. The drive to the new retirement flat was short, but it felt like crossing a vast ocean into a new territory of independence. In my new sunlit flat, the air feels entirely different. There are no expensive carpets I am afraid to step on, and no minimalist rules dictating how I should live. On my first morning there, I bought bright, unapologetic red geraniums and placed them on the windowsill where the sun catches them perfectly. In the afternoons, I join the other residents in the communal lounge for tea and biscuits. We sit in comfortable chairs, and I slowly learn to speak again, sharing my memories of the hospital laundry, the struggles of the old neighbourhood, and the deep love of my late husband. I speak without ever apologising for my accent, without checking to see if someone is rolling their eyes, and I am met with knowing nods, shared laughter, and genuine respect from people who have lived exactly the same unpolished life. Helen did not call for several weeks after our confrontation. When she finally did visit, standing awkwardly in the doorway of my new flat, with an expensive box of chocolates she didn't know if I could eat, the dynamic was fundamentally altered. She sat on the edge of the sofa, looking uncomfortable, awkward, and deeply ashamed in a way that finally, rightfully, belonged entirely to her and not to me. I received her gently, offering her tea and polite conversation, because my heart is not built for holding on to bitter vengeance. However, I no longer rearranged my posture, my words, or my reality to make her feel comfortable in her guilt. I did not offer her the cheap absolution she was desperately seeking. Our relationship remains tender, tied together by the undeniable bond of blood, but it is permanently damaged by the truths that can never be unsaid. Yet, in the quiet space that now exists between us, my dignity has been entirely restored. I am no longer a social burden to be managed by an embarrassed child. I am no longer a shameful past that needs to be tucked away in a dark cupboard before the guests arrive. And I am no longer a mother whose value is strictly measured by how useful she can be or how silently she can disappear. I am an old woman with a full, complicated, beautiful life, a clear and unbreakable boundary, and the absolute, unalienable right to be seen exactly as I am. Tell me, when people stop seeing your worth, how do you remember who you are?